I'm so pleased that everybody is able to be here. And as I said, this is a workshop that I think is really, really important, really useful, really helpful. Two wonderful presenters, Dr. Dolly Clock, who is an alumna and also a parent of a current Marlboro student, and Jonathan Crystal, who is a lawyer and a prosecutor, and they're both great speakers. And so I'm going to mute myself and turn it over to you, Ms. Dr. Clock.
Thank you, Dr. Crandall. So great to be with all of you. I am going to just share my screen here. See it? Thumbs up? Okay, perfect. So hi, everyone. So as Dr. Crandall said, I'm Dr. Dolly Clock. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Jonathan and I are both so grateful. Just a little bit about me before we dive in so you understand the perspective from which I'm coming. I'm a family medicine physician and I'm a mom of two teens. I have a high school senior at another school, a boy, and then my daughter, Libby, is a freshman at Marlboro. So that means I'm also a Marlboro mom, and which means I am parenting right there alongside all of you through this party culture. I started adolescents a few years ago because I felt like parents and teens and tweens needed extra support and education around a lot of the issues I was encountering in my clinical work. So puberty, teen sexuality, mental health, body image, substance use, and so much more. And so through adolescents, I offer private and group consultations, both in person and via Zoom. And one of the things I'm most passionate about is helping families connect over tricky conversations at home. So I'm thrilled that you've taken the time to be here. And now before we dig into our topic tonight, just a quick disclaimer. I'm a physician. My information tonight is meant to be general health education rather than individualized medical or mental health advice. And Jonathan is an attorney, a prosecutor. Similarly, he's here to educate, not to give legal advice. So our topic tonight is teen party culture, which sometimes might look like this, but I want to acknowledge that partying happens in different types of settings and with different size groups. And maybe it's a party like this one, or maybe it's just a small group of friends hanging out, or maybe you have a teen who's not into any of the above, but who might be seeing the party play out in live time on Snapchat while they're at home alone in their room. So for my portion of the talk, I'm going to focus on a few things. And just a heads up, we have a lot of information for you tonight. This is jam-packed. So we are recording it, but we hope you will hang in there. I'm coming from the medical perspective. Jonathan is going to give you amazing information. He's a wonderful author and prosecutor. So please, please, please hang in there for him. So again, we're gonna focus on a few things. So I'm gonna talk about the substances that teens are most likely to encounter or use, and those are alcohol, nicotine vapes, and weed. And then there are many other drugs out there, of course, but we're going to focus on those. But I also want to make sure you get some important information about fentanyl poisonings from laced drugs that have touched our communities. We're going to be talking about how and why teen brains are uniquely susceptible to the negative effects of substances, and how social media and our environment influence our perceptions of substance use. And also some things to consider in terms of how to minimize risk. So as a physician, I get to approach these topics from a point of health and safety, and without any shame, without any judgment. I don't believe in scare tactics with teenagers. I just don't think they work. I just want to share some facts with you all, and I hope that you'll take time to think about them and discuss how this fits in within your own families. I'm not here to tell people what to do or what not to do, and I know that this is going to look totally different in each and every household. I'm also a parent, as I said, and I'm thinking about and talking about this with my kids all the time. So we are all in this together. We're all figuring it out. Parenting is not for the meek. So I will be speaking from the perspective of risk reduction. So I just want to be clear off the bat that ideally, tweens and teens and young adults shouldn't use any of the substances we're talking about until they're at least 21, not just because it's illegal to use them before then, but because teen brains are just not fully developed, and that puts them at increased risk of long-term harm when substances are on board. So that's my hope as a physician. But then there's reality too, right? And so there are some kids that are going to use substances anyway. And so that's why I want people to understand the risks and at least some ways of minimizing them. So there are lots of teens that make great choices when they're presented with facts. And sometimes really great kids from really fantastic families make questionable choices. And that can leave us scratching our heads like the guy in this picture, right? So sometimes the mistakes are little ones, sometimes the mistakes are big ones, and they can negatively impact people's health. And so when that happens, hopefully we can all learn from the moment, right? Whether it was our kid or someone else's kid. And for any of you out there, you perfect parents of perfect children out there, I just wanted to share this with you. I love this. I saw this on social media. As soon as you say my child would never, here they come nevering like they nevered before, right? So you never know when things might change, even for your perfect child, which is why it's so important to educate yourself and to keep an open line of communication going at home, and just avoid stigmatizing someone else's kid that messed up or shaming that other parent, especially now in pandemic times. We're still stuck in pandemic times, right? It doesn't look like this, but yes, it does. Here we all are on Zoom, right? So I just wanted to take a minute to acknowledge this time we're in with COVID. You know, the initial lockdowns are a thing of the past, but we have to remember all that these kids have gone through, right? They were only mostly seeing each other on computer screens, right? And then still today, there's this ongoing uncertainty with this seemingly never-ending pandemic. And now more recently, all the political turmoil. Now the teenagers are worried about nuclear war again. Like there's a lot on these kids' minds. So the last couple of years have taken an enormous toll on all of us, and the mental health of teens has suffered for it. So this past December, the US Surgeon General issued an advisory on the youth mental health crisis. And in case you missed it, the New York Times just put out an article this week on adolescent mental health. I encourage you to read it if you haven't already. So the state of teen mental health matters in the context of our discussion right now, because of this discussion about party culture, because we know that when teens are struggling with anxiety, depression, other mental health issues, and especially when those problems are untreated, teens might be more likely to turn to substances as a form of self-medication. And mental health struggles aside, teens also lost out on a lot these last couple of years. So they lost opportunities to practice social and emotional skills that relate to party culture, right? So in the early dark days of the pandemic, the parties largely went away. And then they were back, and kids re-entered the party scene a year or two older, but without that additional year or two of experience navigating complex social situations, peer pressure, and everything else that comes along with that party scene. So another important point is that when the pandemic hit, you know, we were all spending a lot more time online and more time for teens on social media. All of us probably more time on social media. So what we see on social media can influence our perceptions, and with that, our behaviors, especially when we're talking about teenagers. There was actually a study conducted by Columbia University that found that teenagers who regularly use popular social media outlets were more likely to drink, use drugs, and buy tobacco than adolescents who either didn't use social media or used it less frequently. So on social media, our teens are seeing a lot of things, and there are vaping influencers and weed influencers and direct advertisements, and also just like snaps from friends who are out and about and they're partying, right? And so all of this that they're bathing in can serve to normalize partying behaviors and the concept of substance use, and can lead teens to this perception that drinking or vaping or smoking weed are way more common than they actually are. And this can drive teens to make choices that they otherwise wouldn't. So let's get back to those, you know, kind of what were you thinking moments, those head scratchers. And to truly understand this, we need to understand a bit about adolescent brain development and decision-making and how that all plays into this story of party culture. So during adolescence, the teen brain undergoes a huge remodeling project to make the brain more integrated, more efficient. I could talk about this for a long time. I'm going to overly simplify, like massively overly simplify. So there's two main parts of the brain that I want to focus on as it relates to teen decision-making and why teen brains are wired to crave novelty and risk. So the limbic system is the emotional reactive part of the brain. That's where those big feelings come from, also where basic needs come from. And that brown hairy guy in the picture represents hormones, because this part of the brain is really sensitive to hormones. Hormones are a part of our fight or flight response, as well as the sex hormones that are circulating during puberty. So this is a part of the brain that drives emotional feel-good choices, and it's already quite mature and functioning pretty much at full speed, even in your Marlboro middle schoolers, right? So compare that to the prefrontal cortex. That's the part behind our forehead. That's the more sophisticated part of the brain where judgment and impulse control lies. And that's the part of the brain that helps put the brakes on that reactive emotional limbic system. So teens have, and they can use that part of their brain, but it won't be fully developed until people are in their mid-20s. It's a long time for us parents. So, and we know from studies looking at brain imaging that there can be even less activity in the prefrontal cortex when peers are in the picture. So this further drives the teen brain toward making those impulsive, feel-good choices, especially when peers are around. So this is the physiologic answer to the question of what were you thinking? Also part of this story of teen brain as it relates to the party culture is the fact that teen brains have a revved up reward system. And this involves a neurochemical dopamine, which acts as a feel-good hormone for reward. It rewards us for trying new and pleasurable things. So drugs and alcohol, substances hijack this dopamine reward system. And in teens, they rewire the brain so that it will need more of the substance to not just feel good, but to feel normal. So this is why teen brains are uniquely vulnerable to substances compared to adult brains, and why addiction can be more likely when people start using substances as teens rather than as adults. Okay, so back to this party discussion. So let's talk about those 3 substances that teens are most likely to encounter, starting with alcohol. And statistically speaking, whether we're talking about an 8th grader or a high school senior, alcohol is a substance that teens are most likely to have used. There are very large national surveys that show us trends in teen behaviors that can impact health. And the good news is that when we look at the big picture, overall, adolescent use of alcohol and substances has been steadily decreasing in recent years. In many ways, this current generation of teens is among the healthiest we have seen in decades in terms of substance use. So what are the numbers? These are the stats from the 2021 Monitoring the Future survey. So this is a large national survey conducted by the University of Michigan. Here are the percentages, 8th graders. This is the percent of teens who reported using alcohol in the past year. 17% of 8th graders, 28% of 10th graders by seniors. About half of kids have used alcohol in the past year. Of course, that means that about half have not, right? So I just want you to know that, because it comes back to this idea of perception. Because when people feel like everyone is drinking, then teens might feel more likely to feel pressure to partake, and parents often may feel like there's no point in having family rules around alcohol because they're all doing it. Everybody's drinking. All those teenagers are, but not everyone is. But some are. So that's why we're talking about it. All right. In my community, this is what I hear about the most from teens. They're drinking hard seltzers, White Claws, Trulies, that, and the vodka or tequila or whatever hard alcohol people have access to. Often it's stuff they sneak from, or sometimes they're provided by parents. Occasionally beer. Not all alcohol is created equal. You know this as parents, but this is like information that's worth sort of reviewing with your teenagers, right? So these are what's referred to as standard drink equivalents. 1 12-ounce beer, that's 5% alcohol, is considered one standard drink, right? Those White Claws and Trulies that they're drinking are also 5% alcohol. There's some new, White Claw now has the new surges. Those are 8% alcohol, so they're more potent. So as you can see, the volume of the beverage in one standard drink depends on the alcohol percentage. And I love this visual because it throws in the equivalents in the ever pervasive red Solo cup. So if you would fill that Solo cup with straight vodka, that would not be one drink, right? That's 8. This is a table that gives an idea of the typical blood alcohol content for males and females based on body weight and the number of drinks consumed with that standard drink size in mind. This is from California DMV. So adults over the age of 21 in California, that's all of us parents, a blood alcohol content of 0.08%. is considered legally intoxicated. This is not the cutoff for people under the age of 21. For them, it's illegal to drive with any alcohol at all on board, 0.01% or more. And according to this chart, even one drink will get you there. So the effects of alcohol are progressive. We know that, but again, I'm telling you this stuff. This is like kind of the same information when I present to parents and teens together. I want you to sort of hear this. So, first at lower blood alcohol concentrations, people may feel happy and excited, but already at those lower doses, alcohol affects judgment, fine motor coordination, reaction time. And then at more moderate and increasing concentrations, gross motor coordination, reflexes are impacted. These are the people that you see staggering around at the party or whose speech is starting to get slurred, right? And then vomiting can ensue. Those are the teens yakking at the party, right? And then people can also black out, where they have, they lose their memory. They have memory loss for stuff that happened while they were drunk. And then as blood alcohol continues to rise, people can lose their basic self-protective reflexes, right? This is where things can really get dangerous, right? They can pass out, lose their gag reflex. That's a reflex that keeps us from choking on our food or on our own vomit. And then of course, at the highest blood alcohol content, people eventually lose their basic drive to breathe and their basic heart function. And that's when people can die. So also important to know that other sedatives like opiates, those are the oxys or the Percocets or the Vicodins, or benzos like Valium and Xanax, those can also suppress respiratory drive, which is why combining any of those substances with alcohol can be even more dangerous and potentially deadly. And then, of course, there are long-term effects of chronic alcohol abuse on the brain, especially around memory formation and attention and concentration, abstract thinking, and more and more. And the adolescent brain is just more susceptible to some of these dangerous effects. So from that risk reduction perspective, what I try to communicate to teens when I'm talking to them is, when you've been drinking, your judgment is impaired. And when your judgment is impaired, you might make choices that you wouldn't make if you were sober, like making choices to use other substances that you otherwise wouldn't, or finding yourself in an unsafe situation, or getting involved in a physical or a sexual assault, or not using barrier protection to prevent sexual infections or pregnancy, right? So these are all things that might happen that wouldn't happen if you were sober. So part of teen party culture is pre-gaming or drinking games like beer pong. Not everyone is taking part in this, but teens need to know that drinking large amounts of alcohol in a short period of time leads to rapid accumulation of alcohol in the brain. So if you're going to be drinking, this is as I say to teens, and I hope that they don't for the reasons I said before, but if they do, right, your teens should be the one in control of the rate at which they're drinking, not the game, not someone else. So the person who's nursing one beer or one night White Claw all night long is going to be in a much less precarious situation than the person doing shots or shotgunning multiple beers. And then of course, the person sipping water from the solo cup is at even lower risk. And a lot of times no one knows what's actually in that solo cup. Mixing alcohol and stimulants like caffeine or medications like Adderall can be incredibly dangerous. And I hear this from teens, like they think they're going to sober up, right? This will not help you sober up. The only thing that sobers you up from alcohol is time once you've stopped drinking. Alcohol is a sedative, and this is actually a natural protective property because when your blood alcohol concentration increases, you get sleepy. If you first fall asleep, you stop drinking, right? But having stimulants on board blunts the sedative effects of alcohol, so you might feel more awake, but your blood alcohol content is going to continue to rise, even though you may not feel like it is, which can get people into dangerous territory. So alcohol poisoning is extremely dangerous. Teens need to know that if they're at a party and their friend is passed out, they're unconscious and vomiting, or they're not breathing regularly, any of the above, or if they're just concerned for their health and safety, they need to call 911 and they need to wait with their friend while they do. Jonathan, in his piece, he's going to talk about 911 immunity laws that will protect your teens in this situation if they're calling 911 in a party situation. Or perhaps you're the parent and you're the one that's around and calling the ambulance, right? So while people are waiting for the ambulance, here's something, a basic thing you can do to help keep that passed out person safe, you know, by putting them in the recovery positions called the Bacchus remover. And the reason this helps is because if someone is lying on their back while they're passed out and they start vomiting, they can aspirate their own vomit and choke on it, which can lead them to stop breathing and to die. So just a little safety tip while you're waiting for help. Okay, so we're going to change gears. I wanted to talk about vaping. Hopefully, you know, both high school parents and middle school parents ask me about this, particularly middle school parents feel like this is sort of like the entry substance. So vaping continues to be the predominant method of nicotine consumption among young people. So here are the stats. About 1 in 8 8th graders, 1 in 5 10th graders, and 1 in 4 seniors reported vaping nicotine in the last year. A few years ago, everyone was talking about jewels and jeweling. Do you remember that, right? They look like this. You charge them via USB port. They look like little thumb drives. It was super sneaky. Teens were charging them in front of their parents. Parents didn't know what that was. So this company, Juul, spent a lot of money on marketing that appealed to teens, and it quickly catapulted them to being a top brand worth tens of billions of dollars. Juuls are still around, but now there's more regulation and less flavor options for them. So people have moved on. So this is what I hear about from teens. These brands are very popular, Flumes and Puffs. These are more affordable, they're disposable, and there are countless others, of course, and these come in lots and lots of flavors. And that matters because there's research that shows that 80% of kids who've used tobacco started with a flavored product. So what's the big deal? Why do I care about kids? It's just vaping. What's the big deal? I care because it can make them sick. So this came across my newsfeed a few weeks ago. And at first I thought it was a picture from the vaping epidemic. Do you all remember that? Back in 2019, pre-pandemic, we had this other epidemic going on, the vaping epidemic, where people were getting really, really sick from vaping. But this is not from that. This just happened in January to this 18-year-old girl who woke up with what she thought was a cold, but ended up in the hospital and on life support. She'd been vaping since the age of 14. And she said, I just want people to know that it's really not worth it. I want it to be known that it's as dangerous as people say it is, and it's a lot more common than people think it is. So I'm not sharing this to scare or terrify anyone. Certainly there are people who have been vaping for years and this didn't happen to them, right? But we just have to recognize that if you're vaping, you're risking your health because it's not just flavored air. So what is in there? This is what's in that vaping fluid is an aerosol, right? And it contains substances like ultrafine particles, heavy metals. Some of the chemicals that are used for flavoring are known carcinogens or have been tied to lung disease. Our lungs are designed to breathe air and exchange oxygen, not all this other stuff. So most e-liquid contains nicotine. The other thing in there sometimes is cannabis or weed, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So the teen brain is more susceptible to addiction of all types, and nicotine is highly addictive. It's also really hard to quit vaping or smoking because the brain creates new nicotine receptors after a very short period of use. And people can develop physical dependence on nicotine and withdrawal symptoms. So folks develop these strong cravings and they can develop uncomfortable symptoms like irritability and anxiety and mood swings and on, right? And I just want to pause on the anxiety and the mood changes because there's an association between nicotine use and depression and anxiety. And that's because nicotine interrupts the pathway of neurochemicals that are important in our mood regulation. So this is important to know because I've heard from teens over the years who've said they were vaping to deal with their anxiety, when in reality, the nicotine was probably making their symptoms even worse. And since vaping's still relatively new, anyone that vapes is a guinea pig. We've learned a lot in the past few years, and we know that vaping can cause acute lung injury in the short term. And it's still too early to know what the long-term health impact of vaping will be, especially when we're talking about people who start as tweens or teens. Okay, so you can't talk about vaping without also talking about weed. We're living here in California, all of us, right, where cannabis use is legal here for both medical and recreational use and for over the age of 21, let me throw that in there. And here in LA, We've all seen the dispensaries that are scattered all over the place and billboards advertising weed and delivery services everywhere you look. So it feels very accessible, and parents have a lot of questions and concerns about teens and weed. Others seem to think it's no big deal. So let's talk about it. And some parents get a little antsy when I start talking about weed. I'm not talking about all of you with your adult brains. It's legal for you. You get to do what you want, right? We're talking about teenagers. So here are the national statistics. And I get challenged on this from parents here in LA that feel like the rates must be higher in states where marijuana has been legalized, because this is national data. So far the data doesn't really bear that out. It'll be interesting to see if that changes over time. I'll tell you what the CDC high school data from California does show. And that comes from another big survey that comes out every 2 years called the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. And the 2019 results, which are the most recent, show no difference in the amount of California teens that reported currently using marijuana compared to other states where it wasn't legal. And interestingly, California teens were less likely to have ever used marijuana in their lifetime. That was surprising to me. But what they did find was that California high schoolers were more likely than teens across the country to have been offered, sold, or given an illegal drug on school property. So there you go. So we'll see probably this summer what the more recent data from the 2021 survey shows. But clearly a significant number of teens do use weed, with about almost a third of seniors saying they had used marijuana in the past year. So whether you call it marijuana, weed, or something else, it all comes from the cannabis plant, right, which contains more than 400 chemicals, several of which are psychoactive. The most psychoactive of these is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which is more commonly known as THC, and that's found in the plant's resin, mostly in the flowers, and THC is what produces the high. There's another chemical that you probably hear of that's called cannabidiol or CBD, and that substance does not create the high, but has some other touted health benefits. So when it comes to recreational use of weed, it's important to know that there's a huge variety of formulations and differences in potency. So THC concentrations in recreational weed has increased significantly from past decades. And this has to do with the way plants are cultivated. So there have been changes in genetic plant selection and growing techniques. So if you're a parent that smoked weed as a teen and you turned out fine, so you feel like it's no big deal for your teens to be using weed, just know that is probably not an apples to apples comparison. And certain extracts like THC wax can have 3 to 5 times the THC that's naturally occurring in the plant, which is also a higher level than it was in the past. So we don't know yet if there will be a difference in health effects from cannabis that's considerably more potent than the stuff that was around when we were all teens, but some experts predict that we may see a higher percentage of users with cannabis use disorder or with addiction. So there are lots of different formulations. These all come from the cannabis plant. I'm going to narrow in on a couple. This is a brand of THC vape pens that I hear about from teens. They're called Stizzies. They look a lot like those Juuls that were popular a few years ago, but in this case, the pods contain THC instead of nicotine. So when Juuling and vaping devices infiltrated a few years ago and their use became somewhat normalized, it wasn't a big leap to use that same delivery system for other products. And of course, these come in a variety of flavors like purple punch and gelato and lemon cookie. And we already learned that the vast majority of teens that use tobacco started with a flavored product. So the question is whether the same will hold true for cannabis products. And just like vaping, this is big business, and companies are profiting by hooking kids. And besides the THC, there are other chemicals in there that people are inhaling into their lungs and absorbing into their bloodstream, just like we talked about with the nicotine vapes. So a quick note about edibles. People are having toxic reactions to edibles, and not just the kids, adults as well. Here's why, right? They take something like a THC gummy, and then a few minutes later, when they feel like nothing is happening, they take another one, and then more time goes by and they still feel totally normal. So then they take another one, and then eventually they're developing confusion, or they have trouble talking, or they develop anxiety or panic attack or paranoia or other psychotic symptoms. symptoms, or they just feel like sick and nauseated and vomiting, or they can even have cardiac symptoms. When cannabis is smoked or vaped and inhaled, the effects in the brain are rapid because we have these tiny, tiny blood vessels that line our lungs that allow that THC to be rapidly absorbed and carried to the brain. But when someone consumes cannabis edibles, things take longer, right? So they have to be digested in the stomach, and then the THC is eventually absorbed by the intestines, and then it travels to the brain. So the effects can take much longer to kick in and can last much longer than inhaled THC. So if people don't know how edibles work, they can end up consuming very high doses of THC. An ER doctor recently shared with me a story of a high school student. This was a local student who was acting out of it in class. So the teacher called for the nurse, who in turn had to call for the ambulance. And the report from the ambulance to the emergency room was that the teen was aphasic. So she was presenting as if she'd had a stroke, couldn't talk, was catatonic. This is what they found in her backpack. She had eaten a cookie and a half. And I'm pretty certain that she didn't imagine that she would end up being carted out from her high school by the paramedics. So one of the issues with edibles is that the THC is not necessarily evenly distributed. So it's hard to know what dose you are actually getting. And this photo brings up another important point about how innocuous looking some of these products are, right? This packaging looks just like a famous brand of cookies. And as more and more of these products become available, we've seen an increase in ER visits for accidental ingestion of THC by kids and adults alike, and vets have seen it in pets as well. So if you have these products at home, please keep them out of reach, or make sure that they are very clearly labeled. Okay, so what about teen brains and cannabis? Weed acts on the hippocampus, which is part of the brain involved in the formation of new memory. So if someone is high, the ability to store new information is impacted. So this is meaningful for teens who maybe think it's a good idea to use weed before class or while they're studying, right? This is going to impact their ability to learn new information. And even after someone no longer feels high, the residual effects on cognitive function can last for up to 48 hours. So memory and learning can continue to be impacted. Also, cannabis can have some mental health effects. Marijuana has been linked with depression and anxiety, and there's research suggesting that using weed during the teen years might increase the risk for developing psychosis in people with a genetic risk for developing schizophrenia. So researchers are still studying this relationship. It's probably very multifactorial, but since you only get one brain for your life, it's something worth considering. Cannabis acts on the parts of the brain responsible for attention and concentration and judgment, as well as on the cerebellum and basal ganglia. Those are the parts of the brain responsible for balance and coordination. So given all that, operating any type of heavy machinery, including driving a car, is very dangerous. I've heard repeatedly from teens who know kids that would never drive drunk because there's a stigma around drunk driving, yet they will drive high. So the best way to stay safe, of course, is to never drive or get in a car with a driver who has used any kind of drug, legal, illegal, prescription, whatever, if it's something that can impair your motor and cognitive skills. Also, if you have athletes, by the way, talk to them about the coordination piece, right? They're not going to be able to perform at their best if they're high or they still have THC on board. So just as a reminder, teen brain is more susceptible to addiction of all types. I hear people say that weed is not addictive, but cannabis use disorder is a diagnosis recognized in DSM-5. It's defined as a problematic pattern of cannabis use leading to clinically significant impairment or distress. And there's a whole list of criteria to make that determination. But this affects about 1 in 11 adults who use weed will develop cannabis use disorder, but in teens, it's more like 1 in 6 and even higher among daily users. So this concerns me as a physician, not because I think all weed is bad, but because of the short-term and long-term effects it has on developing brains. It's not the same as an adult brain. All right, so we've talked about the substances that teens are most likely to encounter and that I hear about the most frequently regarding parties, but there are, of course, so many other drugs. We can't cover everything, but I do want to touch briefly on prescription drugs like opioids, stimulants, anxiolytics. These are the oxys and the Adderalls and the Xanax pills that kids can get their hands on. And the most basic thing for teens to know is that even if a prescription drug is prescribed by a medical doctor, if it wasn't prescribed for you, as in it's your name on the bottle, right, and you got it from the legitimate pharmacy, then you shouldn't take it. And if it is in your name, you should only take it as it's prescribed. And then the next thing to know is that if a prescription pill didn't come from your doctor, you should just assume that it's a fake and that it might be laced. I pass this building when I drive to Marlborough. It's down in the Mid-Wilshire area. I don't know if any of you have seen this. Nothing terrible, like all this stuff we've talked about. I have my doctor concerns about like the effects on the brain and all that. This terrifies me. And I find that a lot of parents are in the dark about this. So we have to talk about fentanyl, which is a powerful synthetic opioid that's similar to morphine, but it's 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. And it's a medicine that might be prescribed by physicians to treat patients with severe pain, like after surgery, but increasingly it's being mixed into street drugs. It might be in heroin, cocaine, and others, but also it's getting laced into counterfeit pills like Xanax or Oxy. Why do they do this? Because it takes very little fentanyl to produce a high. So it's a cheaper option, and it's a good way of hooking people too. So fentanyl is odorless, it's tasteless. In 2020, over 50% of drug deaths were caused by fentanyl poisoning. And that means that people were using various drugs without knowing they had fentanyl in them. When people overdose on fentanyl, their breathing stops and they die. And it takes only very trace amounts to kill you. This image is from the DEA showing a penny, and next to it, a tiny bit of white powder, which represents a potentially lethal dose of fentanyl. That's how little is necessary to kill someone. And it's increasingly finding its way into counterfeit pills. So this data comes from the DEA. The DEA performs in-depth chemical analyses on fentanyl obtained from drug seizures made throughout the United States. So there's a drug bust, authorities seize the drugs, and then they're analyzed. And here's what they found in the most recent report from 2019. 1 in 4 counterfeit pills have a lethal dose of fentanyl. And there's no way of knowing by looking at the pill if there's fentanyl in there or not. And many of these fake pills look almost exactly like their prescription equivalent. So we had a very tragic and highly publicized local case a couple years ago here in LA. You may have heard about it. This story was very bravely shared by Dr. Laura Berman, a psychologist, on her social media platform, and in several interviews. And she lost her 16-year-old son to a fentanyl death during the pandemic. He was at home. He connected with a dealer on Snapchat and was delivered what he thought was a Xanax, which is a medication some people take for anxiety, but it was laced with fentanyl. He had no idea, and he overdosed in his room with that one pill. His mom said in her post that dealers do this because it hooks people even more and it's good for business, but it causes overdose and the kids don't know what they're taking. And she said, "My heart is completely shattered and I'm not sure how to keep breathing. I post this now only so that not one more kid dies." So tragically, this is not an isolated case. This image is from a protest outside of Snapchat headquarters with parents holding photos of the kids they lost to drugs they got from Snapchat dealers. So teens that will be remembered as forever 14, forever 16, or whatever the age at which they died. And of course, it's not just Snapchat, right? But I want to talk about these social media dealers for a minute, because I heard about this for the first time a couple years ago about teens getting, it wasn't fentanyl deaths, but it was just getting vapes from Snapchat dealers. They call them plugs. And sometimes they even get in the car with their plug. The dealer brings them the vapes or the drugs and they get in the car when they make the delivery, which is a whole other potential safety issue, obviously, behind the drug, besides the drug. So I tell teens, number one, it's highly unlikely that the random dealer from social media cares about your health or safety, right? They care about making money. But number two, even if they did, even if you feel like you have a relationship with a dealer, they don't even probably know what's in the drugs that they're selling to you. So when I was growing up, people talked about how it's normal for teens to experiment with drugs, right? This is what's making it scary. Like, it's just not an option anymore because of this, right? Literally one pill, one half of a pill could kill you. It's not worth the risk. The stakes are way too high. Okay, deep breaths. Marlboro should be like sending masseuses out to our homes right about now, or maybe Dr. Crandall can guide us in this, a mindful exercise or something. Okay, so how do you know like when someone might need help? So perhaps you're a parent worried about your child's substance use or you know, one of their friends. So here's some potential red flags, and any one of these alone is not necessarily a sign of substance abuse. For instance, all teens experience moodiness and big emotions once in a while, right? But when they persist and when we see multiple changes in these areas that are persisting over time, then it's time to get curious and time to ask for help. And also just to like bring it back to this time that we're all living in, right? We have to look out for our kids. We have to look out for their friends. We have to look out for our adult friends and family as well, right? So even if you don't suspect substance use, if you feel like someone is having concerning changes in their mental health, please get help. There's so much help out there from school counselors and your pediatricians and family doctors, therapists, hotlines. We have like such an amazing mental health team at Marlboro. Take it back. I know you're busy, Dr. Crandall, but if you're concerned, this is like a fantastic starting point, and there should never be any shame. There's no stigma associated with this. This is all confidential information, and just please get help if you're worried. And you know, if you don't suspect, maybe you're a parent and you don't suspect any current problems, but you're just interested in prevention. So the one thing I say is delay. The more teens can delay starting any substance, the more protected they'll be, because there'll be more time for brain development. And the more mature the adolescent brain, the less the potential harmful long-term effects on their mental health and their memory and learning and cognition and future dependence, right? So if you have a teen who's never started any of these, you know, encourage them to just hold off as long as possible, right? Or if somebody is using, then just encouraging them to cut back. Less frequent use in smaller amounts is better than more. And maybe, you know, maybe you have a teen that doesn't want to drink or vape or use weed or any of that, but they're in a social situation where everyone else is doing. So what are some outs? This is something you can talk about. Like, what are ways of like declining but saving face? So I asked some teens, here's a few ideas from teens themselves, like what you could say in that moment, how to say no, right? And you can come up with more of your own. And parents, you should be okay with getting thrown under the bus, like take the blame, right? My mom is crazy and drug, whatever, take the blame, even if it's not the case. By the way, I've had many teens tell me over the years that they don't feel like there is a lot of peer pressure at parties, meaning they don't feel like they see kids really pressuring others to drink or use drugs, but that sense of peer pressure is just like coming from within, when in reality, no one else really cares that much what other people are doing. And that's another thing to point out. Like, that's something important for teens to think about as well. And then this thought for you parents, you know, I recognize that different families have different rules and opinions, but you know, some parents are very permissive when it comes to teen drinking or vaping or weed, and others have very clear limits and consequences. Just know that what you say matters. You're a reliable source of info about health and safety, and your kids are looking to you for that information. And most importantly, just have open conversations with your kids. Come at them with curiosity. Be involved in their lives, you know, connect with them. You can communicate boundaries while also being a safe place to land if things go sideways, because sometimes they do. And here's something I found on social media a few years ago that I loved, and I was inspired to write it down on an index card. I shared it with my kids, and then we put it in a console drawer so they know where it is, so they can bring it to me if they ever need to. And it says, if you are scared or worried about telling me something, just bring me this note as a reminder that I'm here to support you. I won't get mad. I'll work with you on a solution. So I hope it inspires you too. So thank you. And I appreciate your attention, and I hope this, you know, helps start some useful conversations at home. I will be back for the Q&A after Jonathan's piece. This is where you can find me online and on social media. I'll put it in the chat as well. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Jonathan.
All right, everyone hear me? Can see my screen? All right, thank you very much, Dolly. That was wonderful as always. And we're going to transition to my piece now, and I'm going to continue with our discussion of teen party culture. But as you're going to see, I'm going to be covering some different ground. More specifically, I'll talk about sexual consent and alcohol, situational awareness at parties, social host liability laws, including the use of fake IDs, and what to do or not to do when the police show up at the door. But before getting into all of that, let me briefly introduce myself. Again, my name is Jonathan Crystal. Love being here with all of you, but doing this is not my day job. My day job is as a prosecutor for the city of LA. I like to say I have the second best job in the world. For over 20 years, I've had the great opportunity to help people throughout the city of LA. If you're wondering, the best job in the world to me would be playing for the Lakers. But until they come calling, I'm going to be doing this. And it was incredibly unlikely I'd ever become a lawyer, let alone a prosecutor who enforces the laws, because when I was a teenager, I was breaking some laws and maybe disregarding some laws. I was a troubled teen. I was a good kid. I had a very difficult family situation. I got pivoted off path. And I made a lot of bad choices. And some of those choices nearly cost me my life. But, you know, thankfully, here I am. And I wouldn't go back to those years. They were very hard for me. But I would be tempted to go back for the hair. Also trained and certified to teach on sexual violence prevention with a very large nonprofit here in LA County. But the most important thing to know about me is that I'm a father to 3 monsters. And here I am with my 3 sons, and they're all teenagers. And my wife, Elisa, and I believe that all young people coming of age today have to learn more than the traditional school curriculum, you know, math, history, science, really important stuff. But we need to teach our children, our students, life skills like what to do, what not to do when they're pulled over by the police, their digital footprint, underage sexting consequences, cyberbullying, the list goes on and on. So I wanted to teach my sons, my wife and I wanted to teach our sons some of these life skills. And so I went looking for a book. I wanted to find a book. I wasn't the only parent who wanted to teach their kids this important information. So I went looking everywhere for a book, and I found nothing. So my wife, Lisa, says to me, write the book you're looking for. And like a good husband, I listened. And so I wrote the book I was looking for, and I'm awfully glad I did. It's been very well received. And I've had a lot of challenges in my life, folks. And the 5 years it took me to write this book was the hardest thing I've ever done. But again, I'm really glad I did. For anyone who's interested in the book, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or anywhere else you might purchase books. So I have a lot of ground to cover in a very short period of time. I speak quickly. So hold on to your hats and maybe get a piece of paper and a pen handy. Maybe get your camera on your phone ready to take some snapshots of the screen, because train is leaving the station and we are going to move quickly. All right, so let's start with talking about sexual consent, and in particular, how alcohol can impact the ability to obtain consent. So I think we all know, but let me just clarify and be very clear that consent is needed in every single intimate relationship. Intimate relationships of very brief duration and intimate relationships that are long-standing. When I wrote my book, 344 pages, 11 chapters, but only one time do I say, this is the most important chapter, according to the author in my book. And the reason I say that is not everyone's going to get jammed up in a difficult police interaction. Not everyone's going to be the target of a cyberbully or send a nude that they later regret sending. But most people, certainly not all, but most people sooner or later are going to have a sexual interaction. And there's no middle ground here. You either have consent or you don't. 1 in 6 women, 1 in 33 men, numbers that in and of themselves don't seem like a big deal, but they are, because 1 in 6 women and 1 in 33 men are going to be a victim of a rape or an attempted rape in their lifetimes. Please just take one moment right now. Think about how many people that is. The numbers are astonishing. We have a terrible problem here. And I'm not saying it's going to be any of our children, but it's going to be somebody's children. And the numbers speak for themselves. When we drill down a bit on those numbers, we see that 70% of all sexual assaults, the victims are between 12 and 34 years of age. So we're talking about a crime that disproportionately impacts young people. And when we continue to drill down, we see that young women, 16 to 24 years of age, are 4 times more likely than any other age group to be victims of sexual assault. Again, I'm not saying it's going to be anybody's daughters. However, again, the numbers speak for themselves, and we have a terrible problem here. Sexual consent, let's define it. Baseline definition, you can read that for yourself. What I like to emphasize about this definition is that we all have the autonomy to decide for ourselves if we want to engage in sexual activity. No one's pressuring us, manipulating us, making us feel badly because we've been dating 6 months or they took us to dinner. No one's trying to get us drunk. We have the autonomy to decide for ourselves if we want the activity. And intentional sexual contact without consent is sexual assault. Now, there are so many myths about sexual assault and consent, and I could literally spend my time right now just breaking some of the myths, and I wouldn't even be able to get to them all. But I want to tackle probably the most common, which is this. When we think of rape, we often, a scenario involving rape, we think oftentimes about something like this: stranger, parking lot, knife, or gun. Now, this certainly happens. That's not the myth. The myth is that this is the most common scenario leading up to a sexual assault, because it is not. The far more common scenario is what I call the 80-55-50 rule. Now, it's not a rule, but it's a guideline. And this is what the data shows us, that strangers absolutely commit sexual assault. We know that. But 80% of all sexual assaults are perpetrated by someone the victim knows, not a stranger. And for those of our children, many of our children who are going to go off to college, that number is going to climb to 90%. 55% of all sexual assaults take place in or around a residence. So yes, sexual assaults happen anywhere, everywhere. Most of them happen in or around a residence. 50% of all sexual assaults involve the consumption of alcohol by the victim, perpetrator, or both. Now, let me be very, very clear. Alcohol does not cause sexual assault. Perpetrators are legally and morally responsible for their actions. We simply know that the data establishes that sexual assault and alcohol consumption frequently co-occur. Now, there are all sorts of scenarios where consent cannot be obtained. You haven't reached the age of sexual consent. There's a power differential. But for purposes of my limited time, and let me also say, I'm just touching upon sexual consent. There is tons more to know. Certainly, the information is in my book, and there are plenty of other sources out there. So again, this is just a little bit about sexual consent. And if you want more, there's loads more to know. I want to focus when consent cannot be obtained, when someone is incapacitated, when they are drunk or high. Now, someone could be incapacitated in other ways, but for where our kids are at and where they're going to be for some time in the future, let's focus on intoxication. And really, because of what the data shows, I'll be focusing on alcohol. Now, I don't want anyone being confused that I am not condoning underage drinking, as Dolly clearly pointed out when she spoke. And I really hope none of our kids consume alcohol until they are at least lawfully allowed to do so at the age of 21. But hope is a terrible strategy. So in case that they do consume, as some of them will, I want to cover some guidelines here. I teach on every topic from my book at a lot of places. And I hear more questions about consent and alcohol consumption than anything else. there are loads of questions, lots of confusion about, well, when does someone become too drunk? When do they become incapacitated? At what point can they not give consent? And the answer is, I don't have an answer, that there is no answer. As you heard from Dolly, alcohol impacts people differently. I'm 50 years old. I've been drinking alcohol for a while. One beer does not make me drunk. Other people, it does make them drunk. And adding to the confusion, we do know that when adults consume some amount of alcohol, they can still have a consensual sexual interaction. But at what point does it become non-consensual? And as I tell the teens and the tweens and the young adults I teach, I don't have one answer, but I have some guidelines for you. So let me provide all of you with some of my guidelines. The best advice I can possibly give, the best advice, is that if there's any alcohol present at all, any alcohol consumption, no hookups, period, end of story. Save it for another day. Now, when I teach to teenagers in person, I see a few heads nodding, but I also see some eyes rolling. I get it. This isn't for everybody. For some, okay. Others, not so much. So let me give another piece of advice when it comes to this topic. Normally, it is not that difficult. You can't always look at the objective signs of someone who's highly intoxicated. But a lot of the time, if we're paying attention to people, we can see some examples or some symptoms of someone who's incapacitated. They are drunk. And this is not an exhaustive list. These are some symptoms that some people will display when they are drunk. Now, I think it's great if any of our children are taking the time to look at somebody who they're interested in a hookup with, and they're trying to make an assessment, oh, are they showing signs of being drunk? I'm going to tip my hat to them because that is really great. However, and it's a big however, if we are trying to make an assessment about whether someone's drunk, they are drunk. If we're trying to make an assessment of someone is too drunk to hook up, they are too drunk. As lawyers, and I would suspect we have some lawyers out there, we have this objection called asked and answered. So if we ever catch ourselves, if our children ever catch themselves trying to assess whether someone's too drunk, the mere asking of the question has given the answer. They are too drunk. Now, again, when I do this in person, I see some teens, okay. Others, again, I'm not connecting. Okay, so I have one other idea that I suggest. We generally know, and our children generally know, when they would take their keys from a friend, when a friend should not be driving. And it's very similar to what I'm talking about here, because if you wouldn't drive with him, do not hook up with them. If you wouldn't drive with them, they cannot give you consent, period, end of story. Now, when there's a sexual assault situation, you have the victim, you have the perpetrator, but you often also have a third party, which would be the bystander. You may have heard about Carl and Peter's story. And so Carl and Peter were graduate students at Stanford University a few years ago, and they were riding their bikes back to campus around midnight one night. They were riding beside a large dumpster, and they saw a young woman passed out, completely incapacitated, and a young man was on top of her, sexually assaulting her. They hollered at the guy to stop it. He took off running. They chased him. They tackled him. They held him until the police arrived. That young man was arrested and convicted of the sexual assault. Now, I'm not saying our children should go around tackling people, but the numbers are what they are, and we all have a part to play in helping to stop or at least reduce the likelihood of sexual assault occurring. And there is always something that can be done. And it doesn't won't put ourselves in physical harm's way. Because people want to help. And one of the reasons they don't intervene is they don't know what to do. So in other words, if they know ways to safely intervene, they are more likely to intervene. So here are 4 Ds of bystander intervention. And I want to be very clear. We're not talking about rescuing people. We're not talking about, swinging in like Tarzan or Superman. We're talking about helping people who are vulnerable. Okay, and this can be done in non-confrontational ways. Let's start with direct action. Direct action can be a really effective technique, particularly if you know the people. Direct action could mean literally like separating them and go, hey, you guys are wasted. This is a bad idea. Don't hook up. Save it for a sober day. That is an example of direct action. Delay. Your gut instinct, which we're going to talk a little bit more about soon, is telling you, oh, there's just something that's not right about that. That could be leading up to a sexual assault, but you're not sure if intervention is warranted in that moment. You delay, you monitor it, and you decide at a later time if the intervention is needed or warranted. So you're monitoring it with delay. Delegation. Delegation is my favorite type of bystander intervention because it has the most versatility. So there are 2 ways delegation can look, and probably others. But so our son or daughter is going to go intervene, again, non-confrontational way, but there's safety in numbers. So the delegation could look in one way. They're asking a friend, hey, I'm going to go talk to them over there. Can you just come with me? I'll feel a little safer to have you by my side. Safety in numbers. Delegation can also look like asking someone who's in a better position to intervene. For example, you don't know the people in this situation and it's making you uncomfortable, but you go up to one of their friends and say, hey, you need to go look at what's going on over there. That isn't right. That could lead to a sexual assault. You need to go check your friend. You need to go talk to your friend. Or you could go to the host of the party. Hey, this is your party. Look what's going on over there. You are responsible for what is happening here. You need to go intervene. So that's delegation. Last technique, distraction. Distraction is when you try to get any of the people who might be involved in this situation thinking or doing something else. So I had a student a couple years ago. I was talking about the 4 Ds of bystander intervention, and he came up to me. I think he was a 10th grader. He came up to me after the presentation, and he said, dude, I did the distraction technique, but I didn't know what it was called. I asked him what he did. He said, my friends were wasted. They were going up to a bedroom to hook up. I went over to my buddy and said, hey, someone's outside breaking into your car. He said, my friend ran outside and they never hooked up. Was that a little lie? Yeah, a lie well placed? I think so. Either way, that is an example of a distraction technique. So at the end of each of my little modules, I've covered so much ground so quickly, and what resonates with one person may not resonate with somebody else. And you may want to convey some of this information to your kid or the teen you care for. So what I'd ask you to right now is to just take a quick moment, and what was the one thing, think about the one thing I said that resonated with you, with your family values, that you'd want your son or daughter to know, and maybe make a note of it. And we can talk when we get to Q&A about maybe some effective ways to convey some of this information, but please take a moment. I hope you learned a lot more than one thing, but at the very least, please make sure you remember one thing that you think is most important. Okay, transitioning to situational awareness. Our kids are transitioning out of our homes. They are transitioning out of our care. My son just started college. He's in his first year of college. I got another one transitioning out. And it makes us emotional, of course. And in my opinion, one of the biggest gifts we can give our children is the ability to stay safer wherever their life travels may take them. And the backdrop to everything related to personal safety is situational awareness. Now, obviously, we're going to talk about it in the context of parties, but it applies anywhere their life travels take them. And situational awareness allows us to head off problems before they become problems. In other words, it can give us a 1 or 2 second head start. Now, in a bad situation, a natural-made disaster, a man-made disaster, 1 or 2 seconds can be a very significant period of time. So situational awareness is defined as knowing what's going on around you as you go about your daily life. It's called having your head on a swivel. Sometimes I hear people say, oh, you're talking about people being paranoid. Not true whatsoever. We're talking about just knowing what's going on around you. Sometimes, periodically, when you're out in public, getting your head out of your phone. Obviously, not just talking about teenagers here, people. We adults, we do it just as much, okay? So, and you don't, I try to be very situationally aware, and I don't expect bad things to happen. I don't think they will. I simply realize it's a possibility. And every victim in the history of victims says the same thing. I didn't think it was going to happen to me. And statistically, it's probably not going to happen to us or our children, but it's going to happen to somebody. So whether it's in a party or in any other aspect, situational awareness relies on 3 things. There are 3 components to situational awareness: your eyes, your ears, and your intuition or your gut instinct. Let's talk about situational awareness in the partying context. Here are some ways we can stay more situationally aware. Don't accept drinks you didn't watch being made or opened. Why is that so important? That is so important because we don't know what someone put in our drink. And as you heard from Dolly about standard drinks, someone goes to the punch bowl. They didn't see the punch being made, and it's being made with Everclear, for example, which has very little odor, very little taste. It's one of the strongest alcohols known to man. They get that red Solo cup. They think they have one drink, but they didn't see that punch being made, and they may have 5 or 6 standard drinks in one cup. They don't know how much alcohol was in that drink. Also, never leave your drink unattended. Keep an eye on your drink. Put a cover, like a little coaster over it. If you're even turning to the side. I have had friends, I never leave my drink unattended. Do I think anyone's going to slip something in my drink? No, I don't. But I just try to have good habits. And my friends have said, well, what do you think? I'm going to put something in your drink? I just say, I don't leave my drink unattended. It's not a knock on you. I don't think you would ever do that. I just don't leave my drinks unattended. Also, safety in numbers, once again, arrive together, stay together, leave together. Many of our children are following each other's whereabouts on Snapchat or other apps. They know where they are. Now, I have very mixed feelings about that in general, but when it comes to partying, it's fantastic. Generally speaking, they know where each other are. Now, it can be hard to always stay together at a party, so I would suggest they have safe emojis. Hey, if I send you this emoji, it means I'm talking to somebody or I'm in a situation where I am uncomfortable. Come over and get me. Safety in numbers, safe emojis can be very helpful. Cameras and partying don't mix. This I'm talking about primarily their digital footprint. I've seen many people, and of course I'm focused on teenagers, who have jammed up their digital footprint because someone, sometimes it's at their own hand, someone thought it was a good idea to take out their camera when they were doing things that maybe they shouldn't have been doing. Sometimes we have to ask our friends to put away the camera, and it can be hard to do that, but it's very important. Know the exits before you need them. I think it's incredibly important for all of us, and particularly the children we love so much, to know that when they walk into a school, a restaurant, a nightclub, a bar, pretty much anywhere they're going to go for the immediate future and well beyond, to look for one emergency exit when they walk in. Because if there's a dangerous situation that happens, man-made, natural, and there's panic, Most people are going to try to exit from the entrance in which they came, which is going to probably lead to bottlenecking. It's going to be really hard to get out. And it can be really hard when there's panic to find that emergency exit. But when you come in, it's awfully easy to take literally 3 seconds to locate your emergency exit. You've noticed the emergency exit. Great job. We're happy our children have done. However, if they notice their emergency exit in a situation like this, and they're in the middle, knowing the emergency exit won't do them a lot of good, because if something happens and there's a fight and people are starting to get trampled and you're in the middle, it's going to be hard to get out. So what I've told my own sons, I go, look, guys, I'm not trying to be the enemy of fun. I want you to live your lives and have a great time. But all things being equal, maybe not go to the center in such a crowded club. Maybe just hang out halfway closer to the exits or closer to the exit. You can still have just as great a time. Where we sit can matter. Here, these young women probably having a great night, and I'm fairly certain nothing bad's going to happen, but we know things happen. If they need to exit this booth quickly, obviously the ones who are going to be able to exit the most quickly are the ones on the outside. Now, that doesn't mean that they get up when there's, something that happens and they push their friends down and only take care of themselves and say, see you suckers. No, of course not. I hope they would help other people, but them being situationally aware, knowing what's going on around them, being able to sit in a position where they can take quick action allows them to stay safer, which can also, of course, allow them to help others. And as Dolly talked about, you can't be situationally aware when you're out partying if you don't know how you're going to get home. So plan ahead how you are going to get home. I mentioned previously another aspect of situational awareness is trusting your gut instinct. Our gut instinct has been providing, keeping us safer for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. Your intuition is like an alarm bell that will ring when something dangerous is going on, and particularly when we are talking or interacting with people and we don't really know why someone's creeping us out. We don't know why. We can't explain it rationally. We can't necessarily put it in words why this person is making us feel apprehensive, why this person we're a little suspicious of them. But we feel that way. And it's an alarm bell that will ring and that is there to keep us safer. So my advice about our intuition is to listen to your intuition. It is there to keep you safer, and it will ring. And when we're talking to somebody or interacting with somebody, even if we can't explain it, listen to our intuition. It is there to keep us safer. Now that is situational awareness for ourselves. There's also situational awareness for others. I think all of us have probably been to a party where we see something like this. Now, perhaps these people will assume they've had too much alcohol. Perhaps they'll sleep it off and they'll be fine, but perhaps not. They may be in need of medical intervention. They may have alcohol poisoning. And I've simply seen way too many situations where people like this are ignored. Oh, they're fine, they'll sleep it off, man, let the party go on. If this were any one of our children, we would want someone to check in on them. And what I've said to my own sons, if you'd want someone to check in on you, you need to check in on other people. So just check in, see how they're doing, periodically check back on them. And if you think that they may need medical intervention, please call 911. Now, I hope it doesn't take someone having a 911 immunity law to call 911, but it may, particularly if they're afraid they may get in trouble for having possession or consuming or buying alcohol or drugs. So let me very briefly explain the California 911 and immunity law when it comes to alcohol. This is out of the Business and Professions Code, and the elements are as follows. If you're under 21, you have immunity from criminal prosecution for possession, consumption, purchase of alcohol if you were the first person to call 911 for themselves or another. So what that means is if you think you have alcohol poisoning, you can call for yourself, and then you remain on the scene and you cooperate with medical or law enforcement personnel. I also want to point out that there is a comparable statute in the Health and Safety Code 11376.5 that will provide immunity for possession or use of controlled substances. So I'm not going to cover it here. You can make a note right here that there are two 911 immunity laws in California related to alcohol and controlled substances. So that's situational awareness. Please make a note of your one thing that you'd like to share with the teen, young adult, tween that you care for. Let's keep it going. I got more ground to cover and limited time. Social host liability laws in California. The purpose of social host liability laws, essentially we're talking about drinking in your home, is twofold. One, to decrease access to alcohol by youth, and also to deter underage drinking parties. There may be local laws as well in your city or county. I'm talking about state laws. Sometimes I hear, well, I've got homeowners insurance and I'll be covered. Probably not. Homeowners insurance will typically not cover the homeowner for intentional acts. If you are found liable under social host liability laws, it will be deemed in all likelihood to have been a willful act. First law, civil liability. This is for money. This comes out of the Civil Code, 1714D. This is going to apply to parents, guardians, and adult. And to establish liability on their part, these are the elements. They knowingly furnished alcohol at their residence, which means they made it available, very fact specific. They should have known or did know that the people under age 21 were consuming. There's an injury or a death. They can be sued twice, one by the person who was consuming, and then if they go out and they injure or kill someone by that person or that person's estate. Also, it's determined that alcohol was a substantial factor in the injury or death. That is what is necessary to trigger liability, monetary liability. There's also criminal liability out of the Business and Professions Code, and this is going to only apply to parents or guardians. And here are the elements to establish liability. The parent or guardian knowingly permitted their child, or someone in the company of their child who is under 18 to drink or use a controlled substance. Let me be very clear. In California, under this scenario, under 18, marijuana is a controlled substance. The consumption occurs in the home of the parent or the guardian. There is a blood alcohol content of 0.5 or more, or those people or that person is under the influence of a controlled substance and they are knowingly permitted to drive. That will trigger liability if they go ahead and create a traffic collision. Very limited circumstances. The next law, we're going back to civil liability, monetary liability. It's also out of the Business and Professions Code. We're going to expand the people who this applies to. This is going to apply to a business, a parent, a guardian, an adult, or someone underage if there is sale of an alcohol to a minor. Now, when it comes to teenagers or anyone under the age of 21, that can include sale of alcohol by charging admission to a party where alcohol is present. Very fact specific. Element 2, the underage person was obviously intoxicated. They'd have to look at the objective symptoms, and it's determined that the alcohol was a substantial factor of the injury or death. And once again, the person can be sued 2 times. Now I get asked all the time, well, you know, should I allow underage drinking? I say something similar to Dolly. I don't know. I'm figuring this out just like you all are. We're all in this together. We're trying to raise our kids in a really challenging time for lots of reasons. And I don't have one answer. It's really specific to how you want to parent. Well, what I will say is that communication between parents is critical. Our team, maybe not your kids, but a lot of teenagers, tweens, young adults are exploiting the fact that we aren't talking as parents, and they're consuming alcohol in other parents' homes, and we aren't talking as parents and letting each other know what is acceptable and not acceptable. Very quickly, I'm going to talk about fake IDs, the use of fake IDs. They're always illegal, no exceptions if they are used. There can be circumstances if that possession may not be illegal, but the use is illegal. The laws vary widely. The potential consequences vary widely by state. The state where the person using the fake ID is arrested or apprehended, that is going to be the law that applies. Some potential consequences of using a fake ID. Now, you may try to use a fake ID to get into a bar or a nightclub. You may just get denied entry and sent on your way. Other times, they may confiscate your ID. And if they confiscate the ID, maybe at the end of the night, they just throw it away. Other times, they're going to give it over to the police, and sometimes the police will try to track the person down who's in the ID. It can lead also to arrest and prosecution, and that can also go on your permanent record. There are all sorts of laws ranging from misdemeanors to felonies, far more serious in most instances, and they vary. What I will say is that most of the time, not all the time, most of the time when someone underage uses a fake ID or attempts to use a fake ID to get into a bar, it's going to be treated as a misdemeanor. The felonies with respect to fake IDs are typically reserved for someone who's trying to gain financially by having a fake ID to steal money from somebody. I also want to point out that I have heard of situations where somebody doesn't have their real name on the fake ID, and they are also charged with ID fraud, impersonation, or false identification, because not only is the information incorrect about their date of birth, where they live, etc., but also it's a fake name. Continuing, your driver's license can be suspended, very common, particularly in California, community service and fines. And of course, there can be school consequences, particularly at college. There will be a Good Samaritan policy. Every college is going to be different. Every high school is different on how they are going to discipline their students. But I've heard many, many situations of college students getting in trouble under the Good Samaritan policy when their school is made aware about the use of a fake ID. Woo! Okay, my last topic. I am going to talk about police at the door. Let me be very clear. I am not trying to help anybody escape justice by talking about their rights here. Okay, if you do the crime, if my sons do the crime, they should do the time, and I feel the same for others. However, we never want the stress or excitement of a police interaction to cause us to say or do something that we shouldn't have done. And so it's really important for all of us to know our rights. So some people ask, why should I know my rights? Well, first of all, it helps ensure, not a guarantee, but it helps ensure that the criminal justice system treats us fairly. It can help us hold police accountable. Now, other people, particularly people I teach of color, they'll say to me, Jonathan, you know what? Why do I need to know my rights? The police aren't going to respect them anyway. And what can I say to that? How can I argue with that? We all see what goes on. I can't argue with them. I see where they're coming from. I understand where they're coming from. And I can elaborate that in the criminal justice system, I'm here referring to here as CJS, the failings, and there are many, policing is just one aspect, the failings disproportionately impact people of color. They disproportionately impact people with certain disabilities and many others. So I understand why they would feel this way. And I want to be clear, I'm going to run through a scenario with all of you in just a couple of minutes about how it is supposed to go when we exercise our rights. That does not mean it's going to go that way, particularly for people of color, particularly for teenagers. Sometimes, obviously, people are both. And it may not be easy. The bottom line, though, at least from my perspective, that knowing your rights can give you a greater sense of calm when you have that inevitable police interaction, party or elsewhere, and that is good for you and the police. Here's our scenario. Parents, you're out of town and you have left your son or daughter in charge. Now, you've told them no parties and they're not going to have a party. They're just going to have a few friends over. And the problem becomes that their few friends invited a few friends, and before they know it, things are out of control. Shortly thereafter, there's a knock at the door. And they look through the people, and what do they see and hear? This is the police. Open the door. Now, that moment, if they don't know their rights, they're going to have some questions and some confusion. Do I have to let the police in? Do I have to answer police questions? The answer to both of these questions is no. You don't have to let the police in and you don't have to answer their questions. However, that doesn't mean you shouldn't. That is a very personal decision. Different people have different perspectives about how much they want or how much they want their children to cooperate with the police. I have my own feelings. You probably do too. It's important for us to talk about this as families. Back to our scenario. This is the police. Open the door. I see that our kids are going to have three choices. I'm going to go with the scenario. With scenario 3 here, that they should go to the door and exit, close the door behind them, and talk to the police. So with my scenario, we'll go with the third option. Now, before they step out, let me be clear, turn down the music, ask people to be quiet. They should also compose themselves. And furthermore, step outside, closing the door behind them. And then once outside, say something very respectful, like, hello, officers, how can I help you this fine evening? Now, what might happen while they're speaking to the police? Well, probably only one of 3 things. The officer is satisfied and leaves. The officer questions them. The officer isn't satisfied with the answers or lack of answers and wants to enter the home. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and suspect that none of you think the officer is going to be satisfied and leaves, and you are correct. Scenario 1 is not going to happen. Far more likely, the officer is going to question the teenager. What are you doing in there? Where are your parents? Who's inside? Are you doing drugs? And so on and so forth. So in that scenario, when they ask questions, I think it's really important that they know they don't have to answer any questions. They don't have to. Doesn't mean they shouldn't, but they do not have to answer questions. Other than identifying themselves, they don't have to answer those questions. So they have 2 choices. The first choice is they can answer or they don't answer. If they're not going to answer, I think it's really important that they are respectful to the officer and say something along the lines of, no disrespect, officer, but my parents told me not to answer questions. They can use this into their 20s. Now, what does this do? Instead of them coming across, hopefully, like a smart ass, even though they're not, it could be misinterpreted. With this sort of language, it shows the police officer, hopefully, that they're being respectful and they're following their parents' wishes. Now, what's the officer going to say? What are your parents? Lawyers? Why are you trying to jam me up? I'm trying to do my job. And what are you hiding? And if they don't want to answer questions, they repeat that statement. If they want to answer questions, they should answer them. I want to make very clear, though, that people, as far as I'm concerned, they should always answer questions if someone might be in need of the police or the paramedics. Our rights, again, are to help ensure that the criminal justice system treats us fairly, not about causing somebody to suffer direct or indirect harm. Let's jump to scenario 3 here. Far most likely scenario, the officer is going to want to enter the home and conduct a search. Very briefly, there are 4 types of most common types of lawful home searches. An emergency, the police have an emergency, they're going to go into your home. They see evidence of criminality in plain view, they can go into the home. A search warrant, not going to be happening here. And consent, they get permission from you to enter your home. That is by far the most common way police get consent to search anything, your home in particular, under our scenario. So here, we don't know if there's exigency because we don't know why the police were called. If it's a noise complaint, there's probably not exigency. If they were called because they got a report of overdose, they are coming into the house, period. You can't stop them, nor should you stop them. We don't have plain view here because we can see the blinds are closed, they can't see. We don't have a search warrant. The most likely scenario in which the police are going to want to enter is with your consent. They're going to be asking for consent, but it's not going to seem like consent. For example, I need to enter your house. I need to make sure everybody's safe. Wait, are you asking me for consent? Yes, they are asking. Doesn't seem like it. Hey, you said there's no drugs in there, right? Okay, great. Then you don't mind if I look around, right? Are they asking? Yes, they are asking, but it may not seem like it. So you have 2 choices. If you don't want to consent to searches, you can simply say, once again, no disrespect, officer, but my parents told me not to consent to searches. Again, they can use this into their 20s. You're an obedient child. The officer guaranteed will push back. Why are you giving me a hard time? What are you hiding? If you don't want to consent to searches, you repeat. You can allow the search, but if you're on the fence, always, always allow the search if someone might be in need of police or paramedic intervention. Again, your rights are to help ensure the criminal justice system treats you fairly, not to cause direct or indirect harm to somebody else. Most people do not know their rights. Most people, and I'm including lawyers too. Once you know your rights, you have a great power, and with great power comes great responsibility. We need to use them wisely to help ourselves and also at times to help others. Woo! So that's it. That's my piece. Like I said, I speak quickly. I want to share, before we turn to questions, I want to share my one thing. Hopefully you guys have your one things. And my one thing is, I really, really hope our sons and daughters behave well. I really hope they are good. And if they're not going to be good, we really, really want them to be safe. And what Dolly and I have presented to all of you tonight are ways that we hope they can stay safe now and in the future, wherever their travels take them. Thank you very much.
A lot of information. Thank you so much, Dolly and Jonathan. Even though this is probably the 4th time that I've seen this talk, I always learn something else, learn something different. I really appreciate it. The point, again, is that what we are talking about is a harm reduction approach. We are not in any way advocating for anybody to be doing anything illegal or anything unhealthy with their choices. But we also recognize that the numbers speak for themselves and that these things do happen. And we want everybody in our community to be safe.